Guys, wanted to stay focused to a certain extent on Xerox and HP Inc. In today's Faber report. It's going to go quiet for a bit, it would seem, here as the HP board takes in the offer. Of course, it received a couple of days ago, $22, 17 of which is cash, the remainder in Xerox stock, and decides what it wants to do, beyond, obviously, that statement that we got from them a couple of days ago. This would be actually deliberating and responding and making a decision as to whether they want to either entertain talks to potentially be acquired and or say, no way, not at this price at least. Could be next week, could be, from what I understand at least, perhaps as long as a couple of weeks before we hear from them. But in the meantime, a couple of points of history that I think are worth sharing here that I've learned along the way. In HP's initial response, they had referenced the fact that these two companies were well acquainted and had sort of conversations in the past. That was not the very distant past. That was the very recent past. In fact, as recently as 2 months ago, Hewlett Packard had been in talks to acquire Xerox, according to people familiar with the situation. Those talks went on for quite some time, I'm told, a number of weeks. They, in fact, even occurred after the announced departure of Dion Weisler, and so they took place in, let's call it late August into September, and they did involve what was the exchange of information, in-person meetings. They conducted due diligence, at least some portion of due diligence. They discussed synergies. They signed off on the fact that they believed the regulatory requirements for the deal would be met, that there wouldn't be any real regulatory opposition to it. But according to people I've spoken to, HP wanted more time. They wanted another 3 months to continue to do due diligence, and at that point Xerox said, no, we're done. Now, there may be disputes about why, in fact, they walked away from it at HP. Are there questions they have, perhaps, about Xerox's business in terms of going forward from here? Whether or not they've taken the costs out and now are going to have to look for some sort of revenue increase, which they do not believe perhaps would be forthcoming. That remains sort of questions. But these two companies talked very recently is the key here, with HP potentially wanting to buy them. Who initiated it? It's unclear. It seems as though it may have been part of a talk that they'd had, because remember, they have entered some cooperation agreements just about consolidation in their business. Xerox finally said, after what was fairly significant talks, okay, we're not going to let you go another 3 months. We're going back to focus on getting out of this joint venture, which they successfully did, which, by the way, they closed on today. We should point out the $2.3 billion that they're getting from pulling out of the 57-year-old joint venture they had with Fujifilm, and obviously the elimination of any ability of Fuji to potentially block a potential deal. So now Xerox makes their move, and now we sit and wait. But it is interesting to note that these two companies very recently, Jim, had discussed a deal. HP was engaged. It does appear that they didn't push back on the synergies or on regulatory, but they wanted more time, and Xerox wasn't willing to give it to them in terms of even more due diligence.
Yeah, look, David, I think they've made no bones about how they have what I would describe as a returns-based framework to evaluate M&A. Meaning, no one from in the work that I do is saying, hey, this was never going to happen, it's stupid. Now, there is another sense, which some of the people I think at HP believe that Xerox is a little too desperate, because they want, there's a plan that Enrique laid out that I think has some resonance. But you're right, David. I mean, I think that if they felt that there could be an even better return, they would do this. But they don't think there's a great return versus their own plan. I think, David, you've been dead right on everything, which is that there just does not seem to be a lot of antipathy. There does seem to be people to believe in HP. Why don't you give us a try, Xerox? What's the hurry, Xerox? Why can't you wait a bit? But, again, the tenor of all of this is, hey, you know what? These guys are good guys. It's not what we think. And when you talk about whether there'll be a proxy fight, I think a lot of HP people feel that won't happen because there isn't animosity. There's no animosity, and that would spike animosity. David, do you hear proxy? Because what I hear is, wow, that would be a surprise. We kind of like them. We wouldn't think that they would do that.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a distinct possibility that Xerox would. They seem to be very anxious to try to get something done. You can ask the reasons why they're acting with such dispatch, but it wouldn't surprise me if, in fact, they get a full rejection, that they would want to bring it to shareholders, Jim. But you know what? That's a little ways down the road.
Wow.
The first thing we have to wait for here, of course, is simply HP's actual response and whether it will result in some sort of conversation, which clearly they've already had to a large extent, or whether it will be a rejection and then Xerox has to decide what they're going to do.